are non-exempt and exempt in pay grade. I think pay grade 5 is where most of the changes are going to be, if I remember right. And
essentially.
Ms. Gross and I and Kim and Les have sat down over this once or twice before already. But we decided we wanted to wait to bring it to the council after we got the budget and everything else out of the way. So that's all out of the way, and here we are. So Ms. Gross, if you'd like to kind of go through and
Okay. First, I don't want you not to panic. This does not involve more funding, more dollars, or a change in your budget. So, before we get started. So let's start with that. As it's stated, what I am recommending, and in conversations with Kim, we'll call it the aftershock of what happened when the Department of Labor, wage and hour, changed the base salary requirement for exempt employees. Just as a refresher, as I put in here, it started out currently until December 1st. The base pay that's required if you want to consider someone exempt is $23,660. Come December 1st, it'll be $47,476, about a 100% increase. The exempt classification very quickly, there's two things that need to happen for an employee or an individual or position to be classified exempt. There's a salary test, which is all we're talking about tonight, is a salary test. And then there are what they call the duties test. What did they actually do in their job? And there are classifications for that, which we're not going to go into unless you want a lesson in exempt classifications. But for example, there's an administrative exemption. And based on that exemption, what the jobs are, someone would be classified administrative. Kim's position, for example, would be an administrative exemption. There are executive exemptions. Those are typically people who are director level and or are supervising more than 2 individuals. So you have to meet 2 requirements to be exempt. Okay. So we took care of the initial concerns. When this came about, we said, okay, let's look at all your positions. Are people properly classified? And made sure they were. Where we thought there was a challenge of what the classification was, we changed that to non-exempt. Once that was determined, we said, okay, who's left that should maintain based on their job duties and based on the cities and the hiring manager or their directors wanted to maintain the exempt status. Because you didn't have to. They could have elected to say not, but they said these positions we want to maintain it. So these are things you've already taken care of. I'm just kind of going back a little bit in history. So the city approved pay adjustments for 7 exempt positions to maintain their exempt classification. That's been done. And 3 positions were reclassified as non-exempt. Okay? But what's happened since then, when your pay grades were initially set up, there wasn't really a concern to separate exempt and non-exempt. There was a ton of overlap within the pay grades. At $23,000, almost all of your hourly positions, or non-exempt, fell into that. So there wasn't really a need to separate them. They overlap quite a bit. When you double that basis, effectively what it did, with that new baseline, that was I think $130 lower than your pay grade 6 minimum. So basically, this $47,000 base is your current pay grade 6 position. You had people who are classified exempt in pay grade 4 and pay grade 5. So their base pay right now within those pay grades doesn't hit or come even near close to hitting the new basis for the exempt status. So it really kind of wreaked havoc with the structure. So I looked at your pay grade and said, hey, what can we do to clean this up so that the exempt positions are clearly identified, that the people placed in those positions have their pay grades like any other job in the city with a minimal impact, or ideally no impact, to the city. So what I did was this. I looked at it and said, okay, pay grade 6 looks like that should be the beginning of your exempt classifications. It's already pretty close. The only thing I needed to do is, I believe it was to reduce it to $130 on the minimum. met the new requirement. I changed the pay range, used to be 60%, I made it 50%. And then I said, let's look at how these people will fall into place. I said, okay. Well, I guess let me back up. I'm going into my recommendations here. I didn't mean to get ahead. Let me tell you where you are. With the current situation, and I'm on bullet point number 4, the new federally mandated minimum of $47,476 for exempt classifications impacted the city's existing pay grade structure as it created a significant minimum pay difference between exempt and non-exempt positions within the current structure. The new minimum for exempt classifications is $133 less than the city's minimum for pay grade 6. The current structure has 16 exempt positions classified below pay grade 6. 2 in pay grade 4, and 14 in pay grade 5. The minimum for pay grade 4 falls about almost $17,000 below the new federal minimum for exempt, and for pay grade 5, about $6,300 below the new federal minimum. So if you were trying to hire people into that position, you're already going to be in a challenge because according to your pay structure, you can't bring anybody in above the 25%, and that doesn't even begin to hit the minimum for those positions. So you'd be bringing these people, anybody you replace in those jobs, you'd be bringing them in about the 75 percentile for the pay grade, and then leaving them only a small window for any future increases. Effectively, what this has done is said these jobs are valued more. That's really what's happened. By changing that base to $47,000, these jobs are valued more than they were within the pay structure. So paying the exempt employees at least the new federal minimum meets the FSLA requirement, which you've done. However, it doesn't address the impact of hiring exempt employees into the pay grades with minimums below the federal mandate, nor the impact on existing employees moving through the pay range. The effective pay ranges for exempt employees in pay grade 4 and 5 have essentially been shrunk. If I'm an exempt employee currently in pay grade 4 and 5, rather than having a 50% pay range, I have a 13 and 30% pay range. The confusion, the appearance of inequity to affected current exempt employees in those classifications, and the complexity of the city trying to manage that, should we replace any of those individuals, is the reason that I'm making the following recommendations, which are, starting with pay grade 6, changing that minimum to reflect the new Department of Labor's new minimum, so reducing that down to $133. I reduced the range from 60 to 50%, then adjusted the midpoints and maximums to reflect these changes. Based on the new pay range 6, I adjusted all the other pay ranges 7, 8, and 9. You probably weren't aware, but between each pay range I tried to have a structure so there was about 15% higher pay from the midpoint of pay grade 6 to pay grade 7, pay grade 8, there was a 15% jump in value between those pay grades. So to maintain that, I made those adjustments. So then I said, okay, let's move those exempt jobs that are currently in pay grade 4, there were 2 jobs, and pay grade 5, there are 14 jobs, to the new pay grade 6. Then I left the following exempt jobs in pay grade 6, the new pay grade 6, Director of Vehicle Maintenance, Green Space Manager, Art Administrator, Lab Retreat Manager, Seed Partners, Sponsorship Managers. So they're exempt positions, they stay in pay grade, the new pay grade 6. I shift the remaining pay grade 6 jobs to 7, 7 to 8, and 8 to 9, and 10 was left unchanged. The effect of this, that shift of the exempt pay positions, there was only one incumbent who would fall below the new pay grade, and that was the assistant controller. And my understanding, the assistant controller's compensation is budgeted for adjustment in 2017, and that new level will meet the minimum. So that person, there will be no pay adjustment necessary to make that position fit within the new pay range. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
What's the compensation budget adjustment for the current incumbent?
I'm sorry.
What is the budgeted adjustment from 2017?
I believe it's around $2,400 for the assistant controller.
2,100.
I can't remember what her current, because there was her annual increase or something else had come in, so it was in that like $2,400 range for the assistant controller, to bring it into the minimum level for that pay grade.
I didn't remember that being discussed.
Do we have copies of the way the structure is now, as opposed to the proposed structure?
What you should have attached to this memo is the new proposed change. So
We have
the
the
first ones
existing.
will be the same. When you hit pay grade 6, the numbers have changed slightly. As I said,
Ms. Gross,
the pay range has changed slightly, and then, I'm sorry.
do we have the existing?
No, you had it at the last council meeting. I didn't bring it thinking that you
Okay.
would want another copy.
Okay.
Um,
So what is the existing maximum for pay range 4?
Excuse me?
For pay range 4?
That has not changed. So what you have on here in pay range 4 is identical to what it's been in pay range 5. Has not changed. Only pay ranges that have changed are 6, 7, 8, and 9.
Okay.
Do you want me to run back?
Sure.
And actually, 6 has gone down a little bit, 7's gone down a little bit, small amounts, 8, and 9 slightly down in order to make this work. And then 10 was left alone. So we didn't really increase the dollar amounts. It's kind of hard to explain. I had basically your pay range 6 became the exempt, for the most part, and the exempt people in pay range 5 moved into it. And so I wanted to have the least amount of impact for the change in comp, so that's why I shrunk that pay range from 60%, which pay range 6 had been, to 50. Made it a smaller range, and then left the other ranges the same. So it doesn't really affect, yes, if you ask questions, someone moving in, will they have a little higher maximum? Yes, but it takes years to hit the maximum, as we know, within the city at that point. So that's really the only impact is over 15 years. So, and by that time, we will have probably made some changes to the pay grades.
Just in the pay grades, does that affect any employee that's already met their ceiling?
I don't recall in the exempt employees, and that's all we're talking about, none of the exempt employees were at max. The only ones that I'm aware of that have capped out are a couple, 2, 3, like general laborer positions, and those are in the non-exempt positions. So this did not affect, now it could in effect, if someone were approaching it, I don't recall seeing anybody close to hitting their cap in the exempt.
Okay.
It would give them a little bit more cushion, I guess, and moving up, but there wasn't anyone at that point.
Question. Liz, sometimes we have, I'll say department heads, or maybe other folks that come to us and they'll say, well, I've been here X amount of years, I should be at least at 50% or whatever of the pay grade. And by moving all those folks up a pay grade, how would you tell us to respond if they say, well, I used to be at 50% of my pay grade, now I'm not? I know how I would want to respond, but I'm just curious.
I think that becomes a record keeping on the HR side, is making a note is that with this shift in pay grade, they essentially, I won't say got a raise because they didn't get additional money, but they got moved into a higher pay grade, and that becomes the explanation. They're in a new pay grade, and so they would have to be evaluated based on coming into that pay grade at that time. And yes, in terms of, we shouldn't focus, I know what you're getting at, it's kind of that internal equity and compression, but I think what's more important to focus of this is, are they being paid appropriately for the work that they do at the performance level that they're operating? That's probably more the focus than rather they're at some arbitrary point at the beginning of the pay range, middle, or end. When you talk about where they should be in a pay range, that's sort of, I call that ideal world of comp, and that doesn't happen very often. Probably the best thing is to say, are people being appropriately paid based on their job performance
But
and
that's
the skills required for the job?
It's very subjective on our end to say that this employee was well deserving of 50% of their range prior to, and now not so much. The markers are how we indicate who's being paid adequately and who's not. So if we're changing everybody's markers and increasing their earning potential, then how do we justify not staying consistent with those benchmarks that we've already said you've achieved your 50% mark?
You really, well, I can look at it, you don't have a whole lot of folks up there. I mean, there is that argument, should they be at that, but I think probably the thing to focus on is say, if they're a competent level performance, where might that fall? And it's not a one number. It's probably a bubble of sorts, somewhere along maybe, and again, this is the perfect world thing, somewhere along from the middle on either side, high or low, and that's the bubble that you're looking at. In terms of an individual employee coming and say, well, now you should move me. Well, why? I mean, you're being paid the correct amount of pay based on the skill set you're bringing to the table. The fact that we shifted the pay grades is something the city decided they needed to do in order to basically have a functionally pay grades for their employees based on the impact of what happened with the base pay for exempt employees. It's not necessary to say, you've been here 5 years in that job, now I have to move you to the 5-year mark for that position. That isn't necessary to do. Again, the argument is it's a brand new game, we moved into new pay grade. You could say day one, this is the start of where you were in that pay grade. This is year 1 in pay grade 7, or year 1 in pay grade 8, and then you go from there, would be the rationale I'd use with the employees. It's like, you got hired today, and this is where you're placed in that pay grade. It's probably the easiest way to explain it, to say, think of it being hired today, and this is where you're placed in this pay grade.
But we have some employees who have been brought up to that 47 mark, who have been here for a period of time at least, and they can turn around and say, well, if I'm replaced today, my replacement on their first day of work, fresh out of school, is going to make the same that I do. It really has, the whole manipulation of wages from the federal government has put us in this position, but how do we mitigate that?
And I would say you have that particular scenario, even if you change nothing, you have that.
Just in case anybody...
Yeah, I was going to say, you have that scenario when you hire somebody right now in terms of how well are people being placed within the pay range. I think if there's a concern about an individual's pay, is that needs to be addressed one-on-one and say, is there somebody that even with this adjustment, they aren't where they should be? I'd say probably. It's probably likely. There's when you've got as much going with the number of changes that happen, the issues we're trying to address from day one, not all the internal things are as cleanly as they could be, but the city needs to look at what's our budget, where's our priority, where do we want to spend our dollars. This is not adversely affecting an employee. Their pay is not being reduced in any way, and in fact, it's allowing them potentially to make more money because they're in a pay range that allows for greater growth.
I might suggest that maybe during a department head meeting or something, you could kind of go over this with the department heads, so that way, you've already done that?
We spent the summer going through and did like an internal...
For the employees that would be
did like
affected.
an audit based on gender and race and some other things to kind of look at making sure that internally, which is why I think I've had multiple conversations with Matt, and I think you and I spoke last week, is that the timing of this, as bad as it is for a lot of organizations, I mean, we hit it, I mean, we're in a very, very good position, not, especially because of the fact that it only impacted a couple people, total, I think 9.
Well, I was
And then
gonna say,
when you look
yeah,
at the fact that
7.
we've got one person who is not at that minimum, I mean, when has that ever happened? And to Matt's point, I mean, we can't control what the federal government decided to do when they decided to do it. I think that's really a conversation that's not even probably worth having with people. We've educated the people who've been affected by this and impacted. We've had those conversations. They were part of that process, going through and looking at how many hours do you work, what do you do? Tell me about your day, tell me about your decision-making. I mean, this wasn't something that, Liz and I sat behind closed doors and had a conversation. I mean, this has been a process with multiple people that we started last February.
Right.
And this isn't something that we've been
And the-
doing.
well, and the-
So we have kind of had that process
Yeah.
and those
And
conversations.
the challenge has been, we haven't known what that number was going to be until,
So one point
last
it's been
month.
52,000.
which would have
I
caused quite a
understand.
few
I
more
just
hiccups.
Brought that up because, Scott can relate, because in drainage, we had Andy say we need to move a couple of them up because they're upset, because when we shifted the part-time employee, did a little shift in there, we said, well, we had several employees, one in particular that was extremely upset because what he's making, somebody hired in today be making the same thing that he's making. And as, Scott, you remember that
That was
conversation?
basically a domino effect of a decision that was made 6 years ago.
Right.
That never caught up with us.
Right.
I mean, that's,
That was an internal compression based on existing employees not being moved forward when the pay grades were set in place because there wasn't dollars available to do that. And there was a freeze, I think, on hiring or something, I don't remember all the details, but there
we
was
weren't allowed to hire people above the minimum.
above the
for
minimum,
about
and
3
that,
years.
that caused that compression.
That changed.
Yeah, that was
Shouldn't have
probably,
happened, but-
that caused more of the problem with
There's a lot of hiring.
not hiring, well, and I just say why, but that's what happens, because then someone who didn't get that, 3 years later, someone is getting it, and that caused problems.
Yeah.
So that's why we didn't recommend we do that, but.
Yeah.
Liz,
When I-
I'm sorry, go
When
ahead.
I think of exempt and non-exempt, the main thing I think of is overtime pay. So it's all the exempt people, they don't get paid overtime, is that
They
correct?
do not qualify for overtime pay. Now, you could feel free to pay them that, but you're not
I guess
required
that's
to.
my
Yeah.
question, is we're not paying anybody exempt.
Exempt employees, no. That's probably the thing that people usually think about exempt. They think hourly and salary and overtime. That's a very simple, not completely accurate, but that's how they tend to look. That is correct. Exempt means you are exempt from the Fair Labor Standard Act's provisions, which include paying overtime for over 40 hours in a week.
Thanks.
And that's why you can't just say, you're exempt, you're exempt. You have to meet specific criteria.
I'm sure you discussed this, but can you tell me what the thought process was, instead of us just saying anybody that comes into the city that we've determined as an exempt position, we just maybe put an asterisk by it and put them wherever pay range, well, I say whatever pay range they were, wherever they were going to be in that pay range, and not adjust all the other pay ranges. We just know any exempt employee
Well-
has to have 47.6.
Okay, this is where you run into problems. And pay grade 5 is a good example. You got 14 positions in pay grade 5. Okay, tomorrow, all 14 people leave. I'm just being facetious. You need to replace them. According to your policy, you couldn't hire any of those folks without every one of them being approved for additional pay,
Yeah,
because even the 47,000 is up in the 75 percentile of the pay range, and that already is in violation of your ordinance. And then even if I brought them in there, it leaves them a window of a couple of years within that, 2 or 3 years within that pay range, and they're going to be maxed out. And part of it that maybe helped rationalize is essentially the Wage and Hour Department of Labor came in and said, I won't say they're giving them a raise, I don't want to use that word, but they essentially said, these jobs are now valued $23,000 too low, they're valued, if you want to keep them exempt, they're now valued at a minimum of $47,000. That's the new thing. You can keep them non-exempt, but if you want to keep that classification, i.e. not pay the overtime, you've got to hit the new baseline.
I guess my point or my question was, if we chose to, we could just amend the salary ordinance and say anybody that is categorized exempt doesn't, all that other stuff about coming in at the minimum or 25%, whatever, exempt has to, because of federal law, come in at 40%.
Okay, now here's the situation. Okay, I'm coming in exempt position, pay grade 5, and I'd have to look at it, but it's probably about the 60%. I'm coming in with 5, 6 years, 10 years experience. What are you going to pay me, the top of the range? I mean, and then you pay me the top of the range, because that's what I'm going to say my job skills are worth, where's my raise after that? I'm capped immediately. See, that, you're
No,
you're not
I-
giving yourself any, you're saying you're not gonna hire every exempt employee at $47,000. That's, the federal is saying that's the minimum you can pay, but that person coming in may be worth more money based on their experience. So essentially, we have to kind of get in our head, it's no longer worth 23, they're worth 47, that becomes the new
Sure.
minimum.
The new market.
That becomes the new market essentially for an exempt employee.
I have a question that kind of goes beyond this, though. Do we track number of employees that we hire and number of employees that we lose? I mean, as far as
Refer
our
to you in terms of your
turnover
turnover?
ratio and by which pay ranges they fall into?
I don't really specify by pay ranges, but no, we track turnover rate, but most of the turnover rate is in pay grade 2, 3, and 4.
I would just be curious, I was just wondering if we tracked it just to compare us with other cities and other, employers, to see where we fit, why we lose them, what we could do different, or maybe we're not losing them, I don't know.
I can do that.
Any other questions or?
Because I know we try to get it right with the pay ranges, but sometimes I'm sure we just don't. I mean, maybe we pay too much or too little, and if we need to tweak it sometimes. And I know we could look at market information, but at some point, if we're keeping track of our own data, we can make our own market in a way and see where we're lacking and where we don't have an issue.
Well, certainly that's one of the things you look at is in terms of your retention. Are you having turnover? And then the key thing is the reasons for turnover. Are they turnover because they're retiring? I mean, I don't know what your numbers are. How many are just natural attrition? Are they if they're leaving for other jobs, or leaving for other jobs because of more pay? And you need to have that information before you start addressing whether it's a particular comp issue. Typically in those lower pay grades, that's not the concern. The market is fairly stable in those positions. There may be a particular position. Construction, sometimes if construction's in high demand, then there may be a skilled labor in construction that could drive the rates up. IT used to be, you only have one or two people in that, but that used to be the one that was hard for recruiting. But I would say, and for the most part, in pay grades 3 and 4, it would probably not generally be impacted with someone leaving for more pay unless there's some specific economic thing. I think someone mentioned construction at one point, that maybe getting the CDL drivers was a little more challenging.
Summer has the highest turnover.
Yeah, that was. And so that was something that actually we were looking at, saying, do we need to reclassify those jobs? So that's still one kind of pending, saying we need to watch the market, and they can bring the data saying, yes, we're losing people, we can't hire them, or it's taking us an excessive amount of time to hire those, then you look at it and say perhaps that job's not classified correctly on the current market. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
I need to stop, didn't
Nobody else has anything? That's all we have to meet about for tonight. Kind of expose everybody to this. This is something I think Kim wants to bring probably before the end of the year, right?
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, my fear is, and I don't know that Liz touched on that, but if we're going to be doing performance pay increases in January, I haven't even started to look at what that could do to those numbers, whereas now we've got one person who's affected, so financially, what she's saying today is that there's no financial impact on any of the changes. I don't know that there'd be any changes after the first of the year. I don't think so, because we'd go in the opposite direction, but yeah, it'd be nice to start clean in January 2017. You just let me know what you need me to do next.
My question earlier about how do we answer if there's a 50% now and they move up a pay grade, it's just, we know that we get hit with all different types of rationales for why different employees need more money. And as long as you help us keep track of who these 14 plus 2 or 3 or whatever employees are that got bumped up, that when they come back and ask, or somebody says, no, they need to be up at 50% because that's where they need to be, well, then we could at least be able to have, remind them or remind us that, because what happens is a couple of years go by and we forget. And then I'll say, well, yeah, they should, if they've been here that long, they should be. That's how we did our pay grade. So, and then all of a sudden, boom, you've knocked them up again. And that's just how it happens sometimes, and I'm just, I guess, asking you to help us remember.
Part of the other problem, and I don't want to belabor this issue because I know it was a little controversial at the last council meeting, I think, but, we also have issues when we create new positions. We've just created 3. We've got people who are potentially coming in making more money, and they haven't even started in January, than some of the people who moved up to that minimum. So in my professional opinion, we've just created some internal inequity by doing that, and then some animosity between some of those people who have just gotten that bump to the 47,476 and have been here for 6 to 10 years, and they're looking at people who are going to be sitting next to them making more money right off the bat than they do. So, I think that's the thing that, as a group, that collectively we need to be aware of as well, so that we continue. I know we've worked real hard over the last 6-7 years to create internal equity so that we are truly, to your point, paying people that are competent and performing well appropriately so that they do move through that pay grade.
You also got to keep in mind, Kim, it's the other way too, because we have department heads that just started that made more than department heads that were here for the past 4 years. So I hear that a lot too. Nathan came in higher, Heather came in higher than what Amy did, and matter of fact, Shane just had gotten a raise, and Nathan's still making more than what Shane did with just getting a raise. At least that's what's been brought to my attention.
Well, just in compensation, you have to be careful to compare with yesterday. I mean, what a director got paid yesterday in a position and a new one coming in, there could be 2 different circumstances. So without looking at what the qualifications are, and that happens in every organization. Somebody leaves, and the person you hire to replace them gets paid more money, but are they more competent? They have more skills? Was the value of that person coming into the job? So just because I left a job meaning $50,000. In fact, that's what the city had prior to putting anything in place. It was budgeted for $50,000. The person been there 10 years. They leave, you hire somebody with no experience, they got paid $50,000. So there's no rationale in that.
I understand that. I'm just relaying what employees have said to me.
Well, part of that is having those conversations, and we're probably deferring it back to Kim, because you folks shouldn't really have to answer specific compensation questions. That's for HR and for their supervisors to address. I mean, your concern would be is if you're seeing there's that you've approved and you budgeted for these positions, you've approved the pay grades, you've approved the ordinance, then you've also had Kim and her team and the department heads that are responsible for managing that. So an employee coming to you really should be redirected back to the people who are managing the day-to-day of it to explain what the system is and how it works. Because you're not going to have all the information that Kim's going to have about why a particular pay range was selected or what have you.
What I'd just like to, one for comment is, for instance, I'm an elected official, like the mayor is, and also considered a department head. Well, my first deputy, who is very extremely qualified, makes less, and I'm not asking for a raise, just her and I've talked about this is fine, but I'm just saying to take that into consideration, that she makes less than what other people make. And her job is to be here if I'm not here. So, that, and
Just have a problem taking somebody out of a pay range 4, which would top out at 53.6, and bumping them up to that 6 where they're going to make potentially $71,000. And
Right.
they're topped out currently in pay range 4 at 53.6, but if they quit in March and we hire somebody who has 10 years experience, that person could ask for the midpoint in pay range 6 and make 59,000, which is $6,000 more than what we say it's worth at the maximum today. And that's too much of a difference for me to be able to support this type
Well,
of
again,
change.
We got, part of it, and this is what's hard, this is a huge, huge change. And again,
Right.
you've got to look at, essentially what Wage and Hour and Department of Labor said is they have revalued all exempt level jobs. They've revalued, so we can't think in terms that this particular job used to pay grade 4 or pay grade 5. They've come in and said, doesn't matter where you had them placed in your pay grade, if you want to maintain that exempt status, they have to be
At a
at no
minimum.
less than this dollar amount coming in the door.
At a minimum, not at a maximum or a 50%.
Right, but I'm the employer hiring, my job is now valued in the marketplace, exempt, marketplace, Department of Labor and marketplace coming in. Are you going to say, no, I only can make one raise or 2 raises and I'm capped out? You won't keep that employee.
Right, and I wouldn't be closed-minded to any change, but a $9,000 change of between your midpoint and your new midpoint and your previous maximum is too much. If we took those pay range 4 folks and moved them into pay range 5, then they've got an earning potential
I'm
of
sorry, I didn't-
61,000.
I didn't catch that. You want to move pay range 4?
If we took the 2 exempt employees and moved them into from pay range 4 and put them into pay range 5, they're still going to have a higher earning potential.
They're equivalent, they're in a 30% pay range rather than a 50% pay range because of where the minimum needs to be for that position.
And
I mean, that what the city could have chosen to say is, we're not going to value these jobs, we're not going to change an exempt, we're going to keep them non-exempt and left them where they were. And that was one of the things that went
Pay
through
'em
the hiring
overtime.
managers.
And then we checked, I mean,
And
I
then they
think
would
we
have been
talked about
converted,
that.
and they would have
the
gone to
process-
hourly and been eligible for overtime.
Well,
What I was told, yeah.
I'm not sure that all of these employees should be required to work overtime.
I'm sorry?
That's a point that the management and the administration needs to make, but I don't know that a grant writer needs to work more than 40 hours a week. I don't know that a billing manager needs to work more than 40 hours a week.
Yeah,
Well, let's
can't
back
work
up. The discussion about whether they should stay exempt or be non-exempt, my understanding that had already been decided. They were going to maintain exemption. You can change, I mean, if you go into next year and say, grant writer, I'll just use that example, we don't want that to be exempt, we think it's a non-exempt position, it's non-exempt, and we reevaluate what that comp is for that. But that wasn't my understanding, that these had already been approved and said, we want them to maintain the exempt status, and in order to do that, you have to have the minimum of the 47.7.
And I think that decision
then
was,
in
that
effect
decision was
throws-
made before we decided we were going to cap them out at 71,000 instead of 53,000. If those numbers, if this information had been present when we decided this person's exempt and this person isn't,
This is what I
that-
tried to present.
that might
This
have
is
been a
what I
different,
tried to do.
that might have been a different story. I don't know, we didn't, I don't remember when we had these discussions about who was exempt and who wasn't, but
Brings up a good point.
I mean, certainly that should have been a factor. And I don't know if was that with the council when we made those decisions?
That's what we did behind the scenes, working with people, looking at the job descriptions and looking
said
at,
right.
meeting with
The
the manager.
first thing became, do
department
they
head, and with Les.
qualify based on the 2 tests? Would they qualify based on their duties test is what we looked at.
Oh,
And if they qualify to the duties test, then the question came back to the hiring manager saying, okay, they qualify for the duties test. If you want to maintain the exempt status, this is going to be the new minimum. Do you want that? Can you afford that in your budget? And we looked at some positions, and I think it was in parks, the kind of overtime they work because of the schedule. The determination was made very quickly is we need to maintain them a salary exempt, that the overtime, at the very least would equal that, will probably be higher, could be higher. So I can't speak to the grant writer, I don't know that one, but my understanding is that the decision of the person who they report to wanted to maintain the exempt classification for that position.
As did the utility billing office manager, and they were already at that threshold, so. That made that a little
And
bit
some were
easier as
already at the
well.
threshold, so it became much easier as when they fell below the threshold. I think the grant writer actually was at the threshold by the time we got done with all this.
Yes.
So there was no adjustment
over,
made in the
yes.
grant writer. That is a specific example.
And one more question, comment. Somebody like that, you also need to look at the amount of money they bring into the city.
I mean, those-
I was on council, the grant writer, quote, was on a contract, and then they got X number of dollars to administer grants. So they got like $45,000 extra per grant, basically.
And I'd say typically that would be an exempt level position. But again, the city could vote and say, we have no exempt positions. They're all going to be hourly and everybody's eligible for overtime. I don't recommend that, but I mean, you can go that way. What you can't do is the other way and say everybody's exempt. Because they have to get specific requirements for that. But this is not intended to create, an opportunity, an unfair opportunity for, well, I was at the grant writer or what have you. We're saying basically the jobs have been revalued. We need to clean up our pay structure to reflect that and move the positions where they are appropriately placed with that new baseline and still try to keep the relative value of jobs the same. And that was the need, why we needed to shift the other positions. Pay grade 8 essentially had been, or pay grade 9 essentially had been no
Nobody was
occupants
in
in
it.
it.
Right.
So. And the good news is that it didn't appear to have anybody who you were going to have to look at. Do we need to pay them more money, or do we have to figure out how we're going to budget to put them into the pay range, or let them sit there for 6 months or a year? You can budget for that. Well, if you have any other additional questions, I have to leave and let Kim know, and I'd be more than happy to
Okay.
those as you think about stuff, because I want you to be comfortable, and understand what it is we're trying to propose here. So,
I'm not trying to be difficult.
I know. These are all good questions,
It's
and you're
just-
raising good questions because other people looking at it will have those questions, and those are ones you want to be able to understand.
It bothers me that you say that these levels have been reevaluated. Well, they were reevaluated by somebody else.
You got it. I mean,
That's the barrier that I can't get over.
welcome to federal compliance. I mean, there are things that you just have to do, because that's to abide by the current law, so.
Does anybody else have anything? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
We are
Thank you.
adjourned
Okay,
for
great,
now.
thank you.